Meet Bob. Bob is a photon, which means Bob has superpowers. For instance, Bob is both a particle and a wave at the same time, and Bob can be at more than one places at the same time. Time and space work differently for Bob. Bob has friends. He and his friends come from this laser, which means they share some properties and can interfere with each other. In Bob's world, it is possible for Bob to be split in two identical photons if Bob passes through this crystal. Bob is now entangled with Booby, and they share the same wave function. Also, in Bob's world, there's a half-silvered mirror that has the ability to either send Bob through the glass or reflect Bob perpendicularly to it. Bob is overly excited today because is about to begin a new journey in a new experiment that physicists claimed that it should be able to tell which slit Bob went through in the famous double-slit experiment without destroying the wave function and the interference pattern, which you must agree with Bob is amazing. Let us do a quick reminder for Bob of double-slit experiment. The experiment begins with Bob passing through the double slits. His wave function interferes with itself, and then Bob's position is forced onto one point on the screen. With enough Bobs, it is possible to see an interference pattern on the screen since the probability for Bob to land on the white regions is higher, because the wave function is just that. It is the probability of finding Bob somewhere. Doing a measurement to detect through which slit Bob went through collapses the wave function and creates a diffraction pattern instead, since Bob only passed through one of the slits. This new experiment is a variant of the double slits experiment. Physicists called it the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment. And so Bob begins his journey by going through the double slits without any detectors yet. But before hitting the screen, Bob passes through a crystal and Booby pops out of it alongside Bob. The lovely couple then is separated in the crystal, and Bob is now facing a screen and Booby is facing a detector. Now let us dive into why this experiment is called the delayed choice experiment. Measuring the path taken by Booby automatically determines through which slit Bob went. And therefore, if this measure on Booby is made before Bob hits the screen, since Bob and Booby share the same wave function, it is the same as having pre-measured from which slit Bob went through and will hide the interference pattern on the screen made by the Bobs. But if this measurement is made after Bob hits the screen, we should be able to tell from which slit Bob went through without destroying the interference pattern, right?
Eh ben non, ça ne marche pas comme ça. Il y a plusieurs raisons à ça.
Bob is now really frustrated. As it turns out, the scientists do not know why the measurement of Booby retroactively changes the wave function of Bob on the screen and destroy the interference pattern. Is Booby able to control time? Is this the multiverse? Scientists claim that Booby has no such power and nothing can break the principle of causality, not even in Bob and Booby's quantum world. However, they do share the same wave function. Everything happened just as if the wave function was able to predict that it was on its way to collapse in the future. Furthermore, the only thing we can conclude from this part of the experiment is that space-time itself behaved differently for the particles of Bob's world, especially when it comes to Booby and other entangled particles. But the scientists did not stop after this result. Bob knew that scientists found a way to erase the consequences of the measurement on Booby and restore the interference pattern. To explain the next steps of the experiment, we need to introduce John and Johnny. John and Johnny are the next pairs of entangled photons that comes just after Bob and Booby. Let us imagine that Bob and therefore Booby went through the first slit and John and Johnny through the second slit. We are measuring the path taken by Booby and Johnny with detectors A1 and A2. But this time, a half-silvered mirror is placed in front of the detectors and half the Boobies and half the Johnnies will be deflected towards two mirrors, two detectors B1 and B2 and a half-silvered mirror. Now if we look on the screen, the position of the Bobs whose Boobies went in the detector A1. We ensure that those Bobs went through the first slit, but we see a diffraction pattern, just like before. And the same goes for the Johnnies in detector A2. But if we look for John's and Bob's positions on the screen, whose partners went in detector B1, because of the half-silvered mirror, detector B1 is unable to tell from which slit the Bobs and the Johns went, and we can observe an interference pattern again. And the same goes for B2. The wave function depends on what we are measuring and how it is measured. If the measurement being made is unable to tell from which slit the photons went, the interference pattern is restored. And this is how, by making Bob learn a lot of things, the scientists made Bob happy today. Bob mainly learned two things. Firstly, Bob's world can be considered non-local because of his entangled pair booby. And secondly, Bob's world can be considered non-temporal because the Bob's wave function depends on what is being measured and how it is being measured, and not when it is measured